I've told this story exactly twice. Both times, people looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I have. A starving baby Bigfoot was alone in the forest, and I couldn't just walk away. October 2019. My father's cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. I hadn't been there in 33 years. I went to sell the property. I expected a week of bad memories and manual labor. On the third night, I smelled something wrong in the ravine. The ground was still warm where something large had been lying. On the fourth night, I heard knocking, wood on wood, 3 beats, circling closer. On the fifth morning, I followed a sound like crying into the timber and found something that shouldn't exist. 3 feet tall, starving, one leg broken, eyes that looked back at me with something I recognized. What I did next cost me everything I thought I understood about the world. What I'm about to tell you happened in October of 2019. I was 52 years old, retired from the Army for 13 years, and driving a 2012 F-150 with a cracked windshield up a logging road I hadn't seen since I was 19. The truck complained the whole way. Couldn't blame it. The road had washed out in at least 3 places, and the county hadn't touched it in years. Nobody lived up there anymore. Nobody except my father, and he'd been dead since April. The cabin sat on 40 acres in the Bitterroot Mountains, about an hour and a half southwest of Missoula if you took the highway, then another 45 minutes on forest roads that got worse the higher you climbed. My father bought the land in 1978, back when he still ran the sawmill in Hamilton and had plans for the future. By the time I was a teenager, he was spending more weekends up there than at home. By the time I enlisted, he'd moved there permanently. We stopped talking the day I left for basic training. He wanted me to take over the mill. I wanted to be anywhere else. We were both too stubborn to bend. 33 years. That's how long the silence lasted. He died of a stroke in a Missoula hospital, alone, and I found out from a lawyer who tracked me down to discuss the estate. The estate was the cabin, the land, and about $4,000 in a savings account that hadn't been touched since 2008. I was his only living relative? I didn't come up here for closure. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was uglier. My wife Linda and I had been married 26 years, and somewhere in the last 5 we'd stopped being married and started being roommates who shared a mortgage. Our daughter Megan had moved out the year before, and without her as a buffer, the silence in our house had become unbearable. I needed to be somewhere else. Winterizing the cabin before selling it gave me a reason that sounded practical. The road leveled out around 4 in the afternoon, and I saw the cabin through the trees. It was smaller than I remembered. Single story, maybe 800 square feet, with a covered porch and a woodshed off to the side. The logs had gone gray with age, and the metal roof had rust streaks running down from the chimney. But the structure looked solid. My father had been a lot of things, but he'd never been careless with his hands. I parked the truck and sat there for a minute, engine ticking as it cooled. The forest pressed in from all sides, lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, thick enough that you couldn't see more than 50 yards in any direction. The afternoon light came through in shafts, catching dust and pollen. It was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. I grabbed my duffel from the truck bed and walked up to the porch. The key the lawyer had sent fit the deadbolt, and the door swung open with a creak that echoed through the empty room. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood and something else I couldn't identify. Not rot, exactly. Just age. Stillness. The furniture was sparse. A wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a bed frame in the corner with a mattress that had seen better decades. No photographs on the walls. No personal touches at all. I set my bag down and stood in the middle of my father's life, trying to feel something. Grief, maybe. Anger. Connection. I felt cold. That was all. The cabin was smaller than I remembered, and colder, and whatever I'd come looking for wasn't waiting inside. I spent my first full day at the cabin doing what I'd come to do, assessing damage, making lists, trying not to think. The roof needed patching in 2 spots. The porch railing had rotted through on the north side. The wood stove worked, but the chimney needed cleaning before I trusted it for more than a few hours. Normal problems. Fixable problems. What bothered me were the other things. The woodshed was the first. It sat about 20 yards from the main cabin, a simple structure with a sloped roof and open sides for airflow, standard design for keeping firewood dry. But when I walked around back, I found a door I didn't remember. A solid plank door with a heavy iron latch and, on the inside, 2 deadbolts. Not the kind you'd use to keep animals out. The kind you'd use to keep something in. The root cellar was the second. My father had dug it into the hillside behind the cabin, probably in the 80s, as a place to store canned goods and potatoes through the winter. I'd helped him line the walls with stone one summer when I was 14. But when I opened it up, I found shelves stacked with canned meat, venison, elk, bear, enough to feed 3 or 4 people for months. My father had lived alone. He'd been 78 years old and recovering from a hip replacement. There was no way he'd been hunting at that volume, and no reason for a single man to stockpile that much food. The game cameras were the third thing, and the strangest. I found 4 of them mounted on trees, around the property, good quality units, the kind hunters use to scout deer movement, but they weren't pointed at game trails. They were pointed at the cabin, at the woodshed, at the ravine that dropped away behind the property into thick timber. My father had been watching his own land like he expected something to come out of those woods. I told myself there were explanations. Old men get paranoid. Living alone does things to your mind. He probably had trouble with bears or mountain lions and wanted to keep an eye on things. Reasonable. Logical. But I'd served 20 years in the Army, 12 of those in combat zones. I'd learned to trust the feeling that something was wrong before I could articulate why. And standing in my father's cabin, surrounded by deadbolts and stockpiled food and cameras pointed at shadows, that feeling was crawling up my spine like ice water. That night, I made a fire in the wood stove and heated a can of beef stew from my own supplies. I didn't touch my father's stockpile. Couldn't say why. Just didn't feel right. I ate at the table by the light of a battery lantern and listened to the forest outside. It was quiet. Too quiet. I grew up in these mountains. I know what they sound like at night. Owls, coyotes, the occasional elk bugling in the distance, branches creaking, wind moving through pine needles. But that night, there was nothing. No birds, no insects, no movement at all. The silence was so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I lay on that old mattress until well past midnight, staring at the ceiling and listening to nothing. The wood stove crackled, the cabin settled, and somewhere out there in the dark, the forest held its breath. I told myself it was just being out of practice. 13 years of suburban living had made me soft. The sounds would come back when I adjusted. I almost believed it. But I didn't sleep well. Not that night. And in the morning, when I walked out onto the porch and saw one of my father's game cameras lying in the dirt, ripped from its mount, the housing cracked, but the SD card still inside, I stopped trying to convince myself that everything was normal. Something had been here. Something had torn that camera down. And whatever it was, it didn't want to be watched. I spent the third day trying to convince myself that the camera meant nothing. Animals knock things down all the time. A bear could have swiped at it, curious about the blinking light. A bull elk in rut might have scraped it loose with an antler. There were explanations. There are always explanations if you want them badly enough. But I kept coming back to the way the housing had cracked. Not crushed, not chewed, cracked. Like something had gripped it and squeezed until the plastic gave way. The mounting bracket was still attached to the tree, the screws intact. Whatever took the camera down hadn't pried it loose. It had pulled straight out, snapping the bracket clean off the Yeptopsiu unit. I put the SD card in my pocket and told myself I'd look at it later. Then I spent the afternoon splitting wood from the pile my father had left behind, trying to burn off the unease with physical labor. It didn't work, but it kept my hands busy. The smell came that evening, right around dusk. I was sitting on the porch, drinking instant coffee that had gone cold, when the wind shifted and brought it to me. It wasn't rot, exactly. I've smelled rot. Human, animal, everything in between. 20 years as a medic will teach you the whole catalog. This was different. Thick and organic, yes, but with something else underneath. Something almost chemical, like wet copper and ammonia mixed together. It caught in the back of my throat and made my eyes water. It was coming from the ravine behind the woodshed. I should have stayed on the porch. That's what a smart person would have done. But I've never been accused of being smart, just stubborn, and the smell was wrong enough that I couldn't let it go. I grabbed my flashlight, a heavy LED model I'd brought for the repair work, and walked toward the tree line. The ravine dropped away sharply about 50 yards behind the cabin, a steep cut in the mountainside that ran down into thick timber. My father had told me once that it was an old creek bed, dried up decades before he bought the land. As a kid, I'd played in the bottom of it, building forts out of deadfall and pretending I was the last survivor of some imagined disaster. Now, in the fading light, it looked like a wound in the earth. The smell got stronger as I descended. I had to grab at roots and rocks to keep my footing on the loose soil. Halfway down, my flashlight beam caught something that made me stop. There was a depression in the pine needles, a large one, maybe 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, pressed into the forest floor like something heavy had been lying there. The needles around the edges were pushed outward, and the ground beneath was dark with moisture. I knelt down and touched it without thinking, the way you do when your training kicks in before your brain catches up. It was warm. Not lukewarm, not ambient temperature. Warm, like a body had just gotten up. I pulled my hand back and wiped it on my jeans. My flashlight found more details I didn't want to see. There were marks on the nearby rocks, dark and tacky, smeared in patterns that might have been handprints if the hands had been twice the size of mine. The smell was overwhelming now, coating the inside of my nose and mouth. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The forest was silent. Not the peaceful silence of a wilderness settling into night, but the held breath silence of something watching, something waiting to see what you'll do next. I told myself it was a sick elk, a bear with an infection, something that had bedded down here and moved on when it heard me coming. The ground was warm because the animal had a fever. The marks were mud, not blood. The smell was decay, not whatever my instincts were screaming at me. I almost convinced myself. I climbed back up the ravine faster than I'd gone down, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me, something I hadn't bothered to do the previous nights. Through the window, I could see the edge of the woodshed, and beyond it, the black line of trees where the ravine began. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But I kept the lights on until well past midnight, and when I finally slept, I dreamed of warmth in places where warmth shouldn't be. The next morning, I pulled out my laptop and slid in the SD card from my father's damaged camera. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself I wanted to see what kind of wildlife was moving through the property. Maybe get a sense of why my father had been so obsessed with monitoring his own land. I told myself a lot of things that weren't quite true. The footage spanned nearly 8 months, starting in February and running through late September. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Deer moving through at dawn and dusk, a red fox investigating the camera in March, a cow elk and her calf in early summer. Timestamps and temperature readings scrolled across the bottom of each clip. My father had been meticulous about the setup. Then I got to September. The first clip was dated September 14th, 2:17 in the morning. The camera had triggered on motion, but the frame was mostly dark, just the edge of trees lit by the infrared flash. Something was moving at the far left of the image, a blur of darkness against the gray tones of the night forest. I couldn't make out a shape, just motion. The clip lasted 8 seconds and then cut to black. The second was from September 19th, 11:43 at night. This one was clearer, but not by much. Something large was crossing the camera's field of view, maybe 20 feet from the lens. The proportions were wrong for a bear. Too tall, too narrow. It moved with a fluid gait that didn't match anything I could identify. The clip was 6 seconds long, and in the last frame, just before it cut out, I could see what might have been an arm swinging at the thing's side. The third clip was dated September 22nd, 3:51 in the morning. This was the one that made me set the laptop down and walk outside for air. The camera had captured something reaching toward the lens. The image was blurry, the subject too close for the focus to adjust, but I could make out fingers. Long fingers, at least 6 inches from base to tip, with thick joints and dark skin that might have been covered in fine hair. The hand filled most of the frame, and behind it, just barely visible, was the suggestion of a face. Heavy brow, deep-set eyes catching the infrared flash, a nose that was broad and flat. The clip lasted 2 seconds. Then the camera went dark. That was the last recording on the card. Whatever had reached for the lens had torn the camera down afterward, and my father had never replaced it. I checked the date. September 22nd was 5 weeks before his stroke. He'd known something was out there. He'd seen this footage, and he'd left the camera broken on the ground. I needed to get out of the cabin. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. I grabbed my keys and drove down the logging road, telling myself I just wanted to check the route, make sure I could get out if I needed to. I found the blockage a half-mile from the main forest road. It wasn't a washout. It wasn't a fallen tree. It was a wall of deadfall, logs stacked across the road in a pattern that made my blood go cold. The larger pieces were interlocked at the base, wedged together like someone had fitted them by hand. Smaller branches were woven between them, filling the gaps. The whole structure was maybe 4 feet high and extended into the trees on both sides. I got out of the truck and walked up to it. The logs were heavy, too heavy for me to move without a chainsaw or a winch. Some of them had been dragged from deep in the forest. I could see the scrape marks in the dirt. This wasn't random. This wasn't windfall or natural collapse. Something had built this. Something had blocked the road. I drove back to the cabin with my hands shaking on the wheel. That night, just after 2 in the morning, I heard it for the first time. 3 knocks, wood on wood, from somewhere in the timber northeast of the property. The sound was sharp and deliberate. Not a branch falling, not an animal moving through brush. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, and then silence. I lay in the dark with my father's rifle beside the bed and waited for morning. I didn't sleep after the knocking, just lay there in the dark, listening, waiting for it to come again. It didn't. The silence was almost worse. By the time gray light started seeping through the cabin windows, I'd made a decision. I was going to clear that blockage on the road drive down to Hamilton, and never come back. Let the lawyers handle the sale. Let someone else deal with whatever my father had been living with up here. I was done. I got dressed in the half-light, pulled on my boots, and opened the cabin door. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was a bird, some kind of raptor maybe, or a fox in distress. But the sound was wrong. Too rhythmic, too sustained. It rose and fell in waves, high-pitched and desperate, coming from the direction of the ravine. I stood on the porch, my breath fogging in the cold morning air, and listened. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a fox. It sounded like crying, like a child crying, somewhere deep in the timber below the cabin. Every instinct I had told me not to go. The blockage on the road, the knocking in the night, the footage on that SD card, all of it pointed to something I didn't understand and didn't want to understand. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to get in my truck and drive until I hit pavement. But I've spent 20 years responding to sounds like that. Sounds of pain, of fear, of someone who needed help. You don't just turn that off because you're scared. I grabbed the rifle and my flashlight and headed for the ravine. The crying got louder as I descended, bouncing off the trees in a way that made it hard to pinpoint. I moved slowly, scanning the undergrowth, my boots slipping on the frost-slick ground. The temperature had dropped overnight, mid-20s, maybe lower, and my breath came in visible bursts. The forest was silent except for that sound, that awful keening that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I found it a quarter-mile down, in a section of the ravine where a massive hemlock had fallen across a cluster of boulders. The root ball had torn up when the tree went down, leaving a hollow underneath, a dark space maybe 4 feet deep and twice as wide. The crying was coming from inside. I crouched down and shined my flashlight into the gap. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain refused to assemble the shapes into anything coherent. Then it moved, and everything changed. It was small, maybe 3 feet from head to foot, though it was hard to tell with the way it was curled in on itself. The body was thin, emaciated, the ribs visible even through the patchy dark hair that covered its skin. Mud and filth matted the hair into clumps, and there was a smell coming off it, that same chemical stench I'd encountered 2 nights before, but weaker now, soured by waste and infection. The face turned toward my light. It was flat, almost human, but wrong in ways I couldn't immediately name. The brow ridge was too heavy, shadowing eyes that were set too deep. The nose was broad and flat, with nostrils that flared as it caught my scent. The mouth opened, and that sound came out again. That high, desperate crying, and I felt it in my chest like a physical blow. One of its legs was bent at an angle that made my stomach lurch. Not a clean break, I could see the swelling even from where I crouched, the way the limb hung useless as the creature tried to shift away from my light. It had been here for days, maybe longer, trapped, injured, starving. It was dying. I should have left. I know that now, and I knew it then. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't my responsibility. It wasn't even supposed to exist. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to back away, climb out of that ravine and forget I'd ever seen it. But it looked at me. Those deep-set eyes found mine in the beam of my flashlight, and I saw something there that I recognized. Not animal blankness, not predatory focus, fear, pain, a desperate, wordless plea for help. I've seen that look before, in field hospitals, in bombed-out buildings, in the eyes of soldiers who knew they were dying and didn't want to die alone. I couldn't just walk away. My training took over before my conscious mind caught up. 20 years as a combat medic had burned certain responses into my nervous system, so deep they bypassed thought entirely. Assess the situation, identify the injuries, stabilize what you can. I set the rifle aside and moved closer to the hollow beneath the fallen hemlock. The creature flinched away, pressing itself against the rocks at the back of the space, but it was too weak to flee. Its breathing was shallow and rapid, and up close I could see tremors running through its thin frame. Shock, probably. Dehydration, almost certainly. That leg needed attention, but infection was the more immediate threat. I talked to it. Low, steady tones, the same voice I'd used with panicked casualties in Afghanistan. I don't know if it understood the words, but something in my tone seemed to register. The trembling continued, but it stopped trying to retreat. The leg was bad. The swelling extended from mid-thigh to below the knee, the tissue hot and tight beneath the matted hair. No bone protrusion, thank God, but the angle of the limb told me the femur was fractured, possibly in multiple places. Without an X-ray, I couldn't know for certain. Without a hospital, it didn't matter. I was going to have to work with what I had. I climbed back up to the cabin and gathered supplies. Water bottles, canned meat from my own provisions. I still wouldn't touch my father's stockpile. Strips of cloth torn from an old flannel shirt. Straight branches from the woodpile that could serve as splint materials. My first aid kit, which was designed for human emergencies but would have to do. I moved quickly, trying not to think too hard about what I was doing or why. When I returned to the ravine, the creature was exactly where I'd left it. Its eyes tracked me as I approached, wary but no longer panicked. I set my supplies down and crouched at the entrance to the hollow. The water was the first priority. I opened a bottle and held it out, letting a thin stream trickle toward the creature's mouth. It flinched at first, then seemed to understand. Its lips parted, and it drank desperately, water running down its chin and throat. I went through 2 bottles before it stopped. The food was harder. I opened a can of beef stew and held out a chunk of meat on my palm. The creature sniffed at it, made a sound low in its throat, and turned its face away. I tried again. Same response. It was starving. I could count its ribs, but it wouldn't take the food. I sat back on my heels, frustrated, trying to think. In my peripheral vision, I noticed the creature watching me, those deep-set eyes following my movements with something that might have been curiosity. On impulse, I did something that made no sense at the time. I put a piece of the meat in my own mouth and chewed it. Then I held out my palm again, the pre-chewed food sitting in the center. The creature hesitated. Then it leaned forward, lips brushing my palm, and took the food. I fed it that way for the next hour, chewing each piece before offering it, like a mother bird feeding a chick. It was slow and awkward and absurd, and I tried not to think about what I was doing or what it meant. I just focused on the task. Get food into its system, get water into its system, then deal with the leg. The splint was rough, 2 straight branches padded with cloth, bound in place with strips of flannel. I had to work slowly, letting the creature adjust to each touch before moving to the next. It made small sounds throughout the process, not quite whimpers, but close. Pain sounds, fear sounds, but it didn't bite. It didn't strike out. It let me work. By the time I finished, the light was starting to fade. I couldn't leave it here, exposed to the cold and whatever predators might come investigating. I needed to move it somewhere safer. I thought about the woodshed, the locks on the inside of the door, the way my father had set it up like a shelter rather than a storage space. I was beginning to understand why. Moving the creature nearly broke me. It weighed almost nothing, maybe 40 pounds, all bone and wasted muscle. But every step up that ravine was a negotiation. I carried it against my chest like a child, one arm under its back, the other supporting the splinted leg. It gripped my jacket with those long fingers, not fighting, just holding on. I could feel its heart beating against my ribs, fast and light like a bird's. The woodshed made sense now, all of it. The reinforced door, the interior locks, the heavy blankets stacked on a shelf I'd assumed were for insulation. My father had done this before. Maybe not with this exact creature, but with others. The setup was too deliberate, too prepared for anything else. I laid the creature on the blankets and watched it curl into itself, favoring the splinted leg. Its eyes never left me. In the dim light filtering through the gaps in the shed walls, they looked almost human. Almost, but not quite. There was an awareness there that went beyond animal instinct, a calculation I couldn't quite read. I tried feeding it again. Same process. Chew the meat, offer it from my palm. It ate slowly, 3 or 4 pieces, then turned its face away. Exhausted or full, I couldn't tell. Probably both. I left a bottle of water within its reach and backed toward the door. The locks were on the inside. I understood that now too. Not to keep something in, but to keep something out. I slid both bolts into place and sat with my back against the door, my father's rifle across my knees. The knocking started around 9 that night. It came from the northeast first, the same direction I'd heard it before. 3 beats, evenly spaced, wood on wood. Then silence. I held my breath, straining to hear. A minute passed. 2. Then it came again, from the west this time. Closer. 3 knocks, same rhythm, same deliberate spacing. I looked at the creature. It had lifted its head, ears, small and rounded, pressed close to the skull, turned toward the sound. It didn't seem afraid. If anything, it seemed to be listening, waiting for something. A third series of knocks came from directly behind the shed. I felt the vibration through the wall against my back. Whatever was out there was circling us, testing the perimeter, and it was close. Maybe 20 feet away, maybe less. I raised the rifle and thumbed off the safety. My hands were steady, training again, that deep-wired calm that kicks in when everything else falls away. But my heart was pounding so hard, I could hear it in my ears. The knocking continued for hours. It moved around the property in a slow, deliberate pattern, never approaching the cabin or the shed directly, but never retreating either. Watching. Waiting. Letting me know it was there. The creature on the blankets made a sound once, a low hum that vibrated in its chest. From somewhere in the forest, something answered. The same pitch, the same rhythm but deeper, fuller, the sound of something much larger. I didn't sleep, not a minute. I sat with my back against that door until gray light leaked through the shed walls and the knocking finally stopped. When I opened the door and stepped outside, the forest was silent. No birds, no wind. Just the wet smell of pine and frost and something else underneath, that chemical musk I was learning to recognize. They knew I was here. They knew what I was doing. And for reasons I couldn't understand, they were letting me do it. By the 3rd day, we'd fallen into something like a routine. I'd wake before dawn, check on the creature, feed it pre-chewed meat and water, change the dressing on the splint, checking for signs of infection. Talk to it in low tones, nonsense mostly, just keeping my voice steady and calm. It watched me through all of it, those deep eyes tracking every movement, but it never vocalized. Not since that first morning in the ravine. The leg was improving. The swelling had gone down, and the creature was putting light pressure on it when it shifted position. Whatever these things were, they healed faster than humans. Much faster. I tried not to think about the implications of that. I found the deer on the morning of day 3. It was lying beside the woodpile, maybe 10 feet from the cabin's back door. A doe, maybe 120 pounds, freshly killed. The throat had been opened with a single clean wound, but that wasn't what stopped me cold. The body had been field-dressed, not by a human, no knife marks, no saw cuts on the pelvis, but dressed nonetheless. The belly was opened in a neat line from sternum to groin. The organs had been removed, not torn out, not scattered. Removed, precisely and completely, the way a hunter would do it. Liver, heart, kidneys, intestines, all gone. The chest cavity was empty and clean, barely any blood remaining. I stood over that carcass for a long time, trying to make sense of it. A gift. That was my first thought. Payment for caring for the young one. An offering left in the night by something that understood exchange, understood reciprocity, understood that I was feeding its child and wanted to contribute. A warning. That was my second thought. A demonstration of capability. Look what we can do, look how close we can get. Look how easily we could do this to you. I never figured out which interpretation was correct. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe whatever left that deer operated on logic so different from mine that human categories didn't apply. I butchered the carcass that afternoon, hanging the meat in the root cellar beside my father's stockpile. It felt wrong to waste it. It felt wrong to take it. Everything felt wrong, and I did it anyway. That night, the knocking was quieter, still present, still circling, but at a greater distance. Something had shifted. The creature in the shed ate more than usual, and when I checked its leg before bed, I could have sworn the splint was looser. The bone was knitting. The tissue was healing. I was running out of reasons to stay, and I still couldn't make myself leave. The cold snap hit on day 6. I woke to frost on the inside of the cabin windows, my breath visible in the gray morning light. The thermometer on the porch read 18 degrees. Winter was coming early to the bitter roots, and I was still here, still tending to something that shouldn't exist, still waiting for something I couldn't name. I pulled on my Carhartt and stepped outside to check the woodpile. That's when I saw the tracks. They circled the cabin in a wide loop, passing within 15 feet of the porch before curving around toward the woodshed. Each print was enormous, 18 inches long, maybe 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The toes were distinct, 5 of them, splayed wide in a pattern that didn't match any animal in my field guides. The stride between prints was nearly 5 feet. I'm 6'1" and I couldn't match it at a full run. I followed them. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see where they led. Maybe I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The tracks circled the woodshed twice, coming within arm's reach of the door. I could see where something had paused, the impressions deeper where weight had settled. It had stood there, right outside where the creature slept, listening or waiting, or deciding something I would never understand. From the shed, the tracks led toward the tree line. I followed them across the frost-white clearing, my boots crunching in the frozen grass. At the edge of the timber, they simply stopped. One moment there were prints, deep and clear in the frost. The next, nothing, as if whatever made them had stepped into the shadows and ceased to exist. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark spaces between the trees. The forest stared back. That night, I saw it. I was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the tree line the way I'd started doing every evening. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows across the clearing. I wasn't expecting anything. I'd almost convinced myself that the tracks were the end of it, that whatever was out there had satisfied its curiosity and moved on. Then the shadows moved. It emerged from the timber maybe 60 yards out, a shape that separated itself from the darkness between 2 massive pines. Upright, broad across the shoulders, 7 feet tall, easy, maybe taller. It stood at the edge of the moonlight, not advancing, not retreating, just watching. I couldn't make out details. The distance and the darkness reduced it to an outline, a silhouette that didn't belong to any animal I knew. But I could see its head turn slightly, tracking something. Tracking me. We stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds. It felt like hours. Then, without any sound or sudden movement, it stepped backward into the shadows and was gone. Not running, not fleeing, just retreating on its own terms, at its own pace. I didn't sleep that night either. On the 8th night, the young one finally made a sound. I was in the woodshed, changing the splint by lantern light. The leg had healed remarkably. The swelling was gone and the creature could put weight on it now, hobbling a few steps when it needed to shift position. Another day or two, and it wouldn't need the splint at all. Another day or two, and I'd have no excuse to keep it here. I was thinking about that, about what came next. When the creature lifted its head and opened its mouth, the sound that came out wasn't crying. It wasn't a whimper or a growl. It was something else entirely. A low, modulated hum that rose and fell in a pattern I couldn't identify. Almost like singing. Almost like speech. The vibration of it filled the small space, resonating in my chest. Then, from somewhere in the forest, something answered. The same pattern, the same rising and falling tones, but deeper, fuller, coming from a throat much larger than the one in front of me. The two sounds wove together for a moment, overlapping, harmonizing in a way that felt deliberate, intentional. Communication. They were communicating. I sat frozen, the half-removed splint forgotten in my hands. The young creature's eyes were fixed on the wall of the shed, looking toward the sound, toward whatever was out there answering its call. There was no fear in its expression, no distress, just focus, attention, recognition. The exchange lasted maybe a minute, then both sounds faded and the silence returned. I finished removing the splint in a daze. The creature watched me work, calm now, almost peaceful. When I stood to leave, it made another sound, softer this time, just a single note that might have meant nothing or might have meant everything. I realized then what should have been obvious from the start. I wasn't rescuing this creature. I wasn't saving it from abandonment or death. Something out there had been watching the entire time, circling the cabin, leaving offerings, waiting. They could have taken it back whenever they wanted. They could have come through that shed door any night and reclaimed what was theirs. They hadn't. They'd let me care for it instead. I was being allowed to do this, permitted, maybe tested. The distinction mattered more than I could articulate, and it kept me awake until dawn. I knew something was wrong before I opened my eyes. The cabin was quiet. Not the tense, watching quiet I'd grown accustomed to over the past week, but a different kind of silence. Empty. Final. Like the forest had exhaled and moved on. I lay in the dark for a long moment, listening. No knocking. No distant movement. No sense of presence pressing against the walls. For the first time in 9 days, I felt completely alone. The woodshed door was open when I reached it. I'd latched it the night before. I remembered the sound of the bolt sliding into place, the weight of the iron against my palm. But now the door hung ajar, swaying slightly in the morning breeze, and the space beyond was empty. The blankets were still there, pressed into the shape of a small body. The water bottle I'd left was tipped on its side, half empty. But the creature was gone. No blood, no sign of struggle, no indication that anything violent had happened in the night. I stepped outside and saw the handprints. They were pressed into the mud beside the shed door, clear and deep despite the frost that had settled overnight. 2 prints, one massive, easily twice the span of my own hand, with fingers that extended 8 or 9 inches from palm to tip. The other was smaller, the size of a child's hand, with the same proportions. The young one, and whoever had come for it. I crouched beside the prints, my breath fogging in the cold air. The mud was still soft at the edges, not yet frozen. They'd been here recently, within the last few hours, maybe less. While I slept, something had walked up to the shed, opened the door, and taken back what I'd been caring for. The tracks led away from the shed and disappeared at the tree line, the same place where every other trail had ended. I followed them anyway, knowing what I'd find. At the edge of the timber, the prints simply stopped. The forest swallowed everything. I stood there for a long time, staring into the shadows between the trees. Part of me expected to feel relief. The creature was gone. My obligation was over. I could leave now, drive down to Hamilton, and pretend none of this had happened. But that's not what I felt. I felt loss, a strange, hollow ache in my chest that I couldn't explain or justify. I'd spent 9 days caring for something that shouldn't exist, something I couldn't tell anyone about, and now it was gone. Returned to whatever world it had come from, whatever family. They'd let me help, and when the time was right, they'd taken it back. I walked back to the cabin slowly, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. The forest was waking up around me, birds calling, squirrels chattering, all the normal sounds I hadn't heard in over a week. Whatever presence had been watching the property had withdrawn. The woods felt ordinary again, safe. It should have been a comfort. It wasn't. I found it that afternoon while searching the property in a daze. I don't know what I was looking for. Evidence, maybe. Proof that the past 9 days had actually happened. Something I could hold in my hands and say, "This is real. This is true." I didn't imagine any of it. What I found was my father's journal. It was nailed to a post near the edge of the ravine, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the weather. The bag was old, clouded with age, but the notebook inside was intact. I recognized my father's handwriting on the first page immediately. That cramped, precise script he'd used for everything from grocery lists to sawmill invoices. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1987, 1 year after I'd left for basic training, 1 year after we'd stopped speaking. I sat on the cabin porch and read until the light failed. The entries spanned 32 years, thousands of words in that cramped handwriting, documenting encounters I couldn't have imagined, sightings at dusk and dawn, tracks in the snow, offerings left and offerings received, deer carcasses on his porch, fish laid at the tree line, once a bundle of herbs he couldn't identify wrapped in strips of bark. He called it the Covenant, though he never explained exactly what that meant. Some entries were clinical, almost scientific. Measurements of tracks, descriptions of vocalizations, notes on behavior patterns and territorial boundaries. My father had approached this the way he'd approached everything, methodically, carefully, with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. Other entries were different, more personal. Saw the female again today. She had a young one with her. It watched me from behind her leg the whole time. Curious, but careful. They teach them early. Left a side of venison by the big pine. Gone by morning. Found a pile of roots in the same spot. Don't know what kind. Didn't eat them. Put them back where I found them. They remember. I don't know how, but they remember. The big male recognized me today. I could see it in the way he stood. We've reached an understanding. The final entries were harder to read. The handwriting deteriorated, shaking with age or illness. Sentences trailed off. Dates grew sporadic. Getting harder to walk to the ravine. They come closer now. Checking on me, maybe. Or waiting. Dale called the lawyer about the estate. Won't come himself. Probably better. He wouldn't understand. Nobody would. I closed the journal as the last light faded from the sky. My father hadn't been hiding from the family. He'd been keeping a secret so large it cost him every relationship he had. And now, sitting on his porch with his words in my hands, I finally understood why. I waited a week before going to the authorities. I don't know why I waited. Maybe I needed time to process what had happened. Maybe I was hoping for more evidence, something concrete I could point to and say, look at this, explain this. Maybe I just needed to convince myself that reporting it was the right thing to do. The drive down to Hamilton took longer than usual. The blockage on the logging road was gone, cleared sometime in the night. The logs scattered into the underbrush as if they'd never been stacked at all. Another sign that whatever had been watching the property had moved on. Another detail I couldn't explain to anyone. The Ravalli County Sheriff's Office was a low brick building on Main Street, sandwiched between a hardware store and a real estate agency. I parked the truck and sat there for 10 minutes, rehearsing what I was going to say. Unusual wildlife activity. That was the phrase I'd settled on. Vague enough to be plausible, specific enough to warrant investigation. I wasn't going to mention the creature. I wasn't going to mention the tracks or the offerings or the journal. I just wanted something on record, some official acknowledgement that something strange was happening on that property. The deputy who took my statement was named Russell Tate, mid-30s, local accent, the kind of polite disinterest that comes from hearing too many stories from too many people who've spent too much time alone in the woods. He wrote down my name and the property address and asked me to describe what I'd seen. I told him about the damaged game camera, the blockage on the road, the sounds at night, knocking, movement, things I couldn't identify. I kept my voice steady and my details vague, just a concerned property owner reporting unusual activity. Nothing crazy, nothing that would make him reach for the mental health referral forms. He nodded along, writing in a notebook he'd probably never look at again. When I finished, he set down his pen and gave me the kind of smile you give a child who's afraid of monsters under the bed. Probably bears, he said. We've had a lot of bear activity this year. They get bold when they're fattening up for winter. Knock things over, drag stuff around. Nothing to worry about. The road was blocked, I said, logs stacked across it, deliberately. Could be kids. We get that sometimes. Bored teenagers with too much time and access to ATVs. He shrugged. I can send someone up to take a look if you want, but honestly, this time of year, it's probably just wildlife. Maybe a mountain lion if you're unlucky. Best thing you can do is secure your garbage and don't leave food out. I wanted to argue. I wanted to pull out my father's journal and slam it on his desk and say, read this. Look at 30 years of documentation. Tell me this is bears and teenagers. But I didn't. I knew how that would go. I knew what he would see when he looked at me. A middle-aged man, alone, stressed, probably drinking too much and sleeping too little. The kind of person who sees things in the woods that aren't there. I thanked him for his time and left. A fish and wildlife officer named Carol Vinson came out to the property 3 days later. She was more thorough than Deputy Tate, walked the perimeter, checked the woodshed, noted the remains of the deer carcass that scavengers had mostly picked clean by then. She used words like denning behavior and territorial marking and seasonal migration patterns. She was professional and competent and completely, utterly certain that everything I'd described had a rational explanation. Black bears, she said, standing on the porch where I'd watched something 7 feet tall emerge from the tree line. Maybe a young male establishing territory. They can be aggressive this time of year, especially if they're competing for food sources. I'd recommend installing motion sensor lights and making noise when you're outside. Let them know you're here." I nodded and thanked her and watched her drive away. I didn't show either of them the journal. I didn't tell them about the creature or the handprints or the sounds in the night. What would have been the point? They had their explanations, their categories, their comfortable certainties. Nothing I said was going to change that. Some things don't fit into reports. Some things you carry alone. I sold the cabin in December, 6 weeks after the creature disappeared. The buyer was a hunting outfitter from Missoula named Gene Weaver. He wanted the property for guided elk hunts, 40 acres of prime habitat backing up to national forest. Exactly the kind of thing his clients would pay good money for. He offered $20,000 less than the property was worth, and I accepted without negotiating. I just wanted it gone. The paperwork took 3 weeks. Signatures, notarizations, title transfers. I handled most of it remotely, communicating through the lawyer who'd tracked me down after my father's death. I didn't want to go back to the cabin. I didn't want to stand in those rooms again, surrounded by my father's secrets and my own impossible memories. But I had to go back one last time. There were personal effects to collect, tools that had belonged to my grandfather, a box of photographs I'd found in the root cellar, images of my mother from before I was born. Small things that didn't matter to anyone but me. I drove up on a Tuesday, the week before Christmas. Snow had fallen the night before, a light dusting that softened the edges of everything and made the forest look clean and new. The logging road was clear, no blockages, no signs of anything unusual. Just tire tracks from the wildlife officer's last visit, and the slow work of winter settling in the cabin was exactly as I'd left it. Cold, quiet, empty. I moved through the rooms quickly, gathering what I'd come for, trying not to linger. The woodshed door was closed, the interior swept clean. No blankets, no water bottles, no evidence that anything had ever sheltered there. Before I left, I walked to the edge of the ravine. The forest was quiet. Normal quiet this time. Birds calling, wind moving through pine needles. The small sounds of a living ecosystem going about its business. No sense of presence. No watching eyes. Whatever had been here had moved on, retreated deeper into the wilderness, or simply decided that this territory no longer required monitoring. I stood there for a long time, looking down into the thick timber where I'd found the creature 9 weeks before. The hemlock was still there, the root ball still torn from the earth, but the hollow beneath it was filled with snow and fallen branches. No sign that anything had ever hidden there. No sign that I'd knelt in the mud and looked into eyes that shouldn't exist. "Thank you," I said. I don't know why. The words just came out, barely louder than a whisper. "For letting me help, for trusting me. I hope it's okay now. I hope it healed." The forest didn't answer. I hadn't expected it to. I took the journal with me when I left. It was sitting on the passenger seat as I drove down the logging road for the last time, wrapped in the same plastic bag my father had used to protect it. I'd thought about leaving it for Gene Weaver, letting him discover my father's secrets on his own. But I couldn't do it. The journal wasn't mine to give away. It was a record of something sacred, something private, something that existed outside the normal categories of property and ownership. Some debts don't transfer with a deed. Some responsibilities follow you home. I haven't been back to Ravalli County since. I don't plan to go back. But sometimes, when I'm driving through mountain country and I see a logging road disappearing into thick timber, I slow down and look. Just for a moment, just to see if anything is looking back. 5 years have passed since I drove away from that cabin for the last time. 5 years of trying to fit what happened into a life that wasn't built for it. 5 years of waking up in the middle of the night, listening for sounds that don't come, wondering if they ever will again. I live in a small rental outside Bozeman now. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a view of the Bridger Range from the kitchen window. It's quiet here. Safe. The kind of place where nothing unexpected ever happens, which is exactly why I chose it. The landlord is a retired school teacher named Dorothy, who lives in the main house and waves to me when I check the mail. She thinks I'm a quiet man who keeps to himself. She's not wrong. Linda and I divorced in 2021. It wasn't dramatic. No fights, no accusations, no drawn-out battles over who got what. We just sat down at the kitchen table one evening and admitted what we'd both known for years, that the silence between us had grown too large to cross, that we'd become strangers sharing a mortgage and a mailbox and nothing else. She cried a little. I didn't, but only because I'd forgotten how. We signed the papers and went our separate ways, 2 people who'd run out of reasons to pretend. She's remarried now, I hear. A dentist from Helena named Richard. They bought a house with a big backyard and got a golden retriever. I saw pictures on Megan's phone last Christmas. Linda looked happy. Really happy. In a way I don't think she ever was with me. I hope that's true. I hope she found whatever I couldn't give her. Whatever I was too broken, or too distant, or too lost in my own silence to provide. Megan visits twice a year. Christmas and my birthday, regular as clockwork. She's 32 now, works in healthcare administration in Seattle. Got her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, though she'd probably deny both. We talk on the phone sometimes, short conversations about weather and work and nothing that matters. She asks if I'm eating enough. I ask about her job. We circle around the things we actually want to say and hang up feeling like we've accomplished something. I want to tell her more. Every time I see her, every time I hear her voice on the phone, I want to explain. I want to tell her why her grandfather disappeared into those mountains and never came back. I want to tell her why I spent my whole life keeping people at arm's length, why I was never fully present even when I was standing right in front of her. I want to tell her about the covenant, about the creature in the ravine, about the 9 days that changed everything I thought I understood about the world. I never do. Some things you can't put into words. Some things would only hurt the people you're trying to protect. And maybe that's the real curse of what I experienced. Not the fear, not the isolation, but the knowledge that I'll carry this alone until I die. I don't go into wilderness areas anymore. Not from fear, exactly. The fear faded after the first year or so, replaced by something harder to name. A weight, a responsibility. The knowledge that I've seen behind a curtain that most people don't even know exists, and I can never unsee it. When I drive past trailheads and see families unloading backpacks and hiking boots, I want to roll down my window and tell them to be careful. I want to say, you don't know what's out there. You don't know what's watching. But I don't. I just keep driving. They wouldn't believe me anyway. The journal sits in a lockbox in my closet, underneath old tax returns and my discharge papers from the Army. I haven't opened it in months, but I know it's there, and knowing is enough. My father's words. 32 years of careful observation. A record of something that science says is impossible and experience tells me is true. Sometimes I think about sending it to someone. A researcher, maybe. One of those organizations that investigates unexplained phenomena. I've looked them up online, read their websites, even drafted emails I never sent. But then I think about what would happen if I did. The media attention. The skeptics and the believers fighting over every word. Strangers tramping through those woods with cameras and recording equipment. trying to capture something that has survived precisely because it doesn't want to be captured. My father understood that. He kept the covenant for 3 decades, gave up his family and his reputation and any hope of being believed, all to protect something he could never prove existed. He watched me leave for the army and didn't try to stop me. He let the silence grow between us, year after year, because the alternative was worse. He died alone in a hospital in Missoula, and I didn't even know until the lawyer called. I understand it now. All of it. The distance, the isolation, the choices that looked like abandonment, but were really a kind of love I couldn't recognize until it was too late. He was protecting me, protecting them, keeping a secret so large it swallowed everything else in his life. Some secrets are worth keeping. Some truths are more important than being right. The creature I found in that ravine would be 5 years older now, grown probably, maybe with young ones of its own. I wonder sometimes if it remembers me, if somewhere in those mountains there's a being that recalls a week of fear and pain and a stranger who fed it from his own hand. I like to think it does. I like to think that memory means something, even across the boundary between species, even across the years. My father wrote that they remember. I have to believe he was right. Last month I woke at 3 a.m. to a sound outside my window. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, wood on wood. I lay in the dark, heart pounding, listening. It didn't come again. Probably a branch. Probably the wind. Probably nothing at all. But I got up anyway and walked to the window and looked out at the darkness beyond the glass. The Bridger Range was a black silhouette against the stars, and somewhere out there, in all those miles of wilderness, something was living its life beyond human knowledge. Something ancient. Something careful. Something that had watched my father for 30 years and watched me for 9 days and decided, for reasons I'll never understand, that we could be trusted. I stood there until dawn, watching, waiting, remembering. The sound didn't come again. Maybe it never would. Maybe that chapter of my life was closed for good, sealed away like the journal in my closet, like the memories I don't share with anyone. But some nights, when the wind is right and the darkness is deep enough, I still hear it. That crying that wasn't a child, that desperate, keening sound that led me down into the ravine and changed everything. And I wonder if I did the right thing. I wonder if they remember me the way I remember them. I wonder what my father understood at the end, alone in that hospital bed, that he never got the chance to tell me. Some debts don't come with receipts. Some doors, once opened, don't fully close. I know that now. I'll know it until the day I die. And if you ever find yourself alone in wild country, truly alone, with the silence pressing in and the darkness watching, remember what I told you. Remember that some things in this world don't fit into categories. Some things exist whether we believe in them or not. They're out there, and they remember. God help me, they remember.